Welcome to Formation on this Friday morning. How y'all feeling today? Good? A little cooler weather? Yeah? That feels good? A little cooler weather? We got a little bit of rain this week. Thankful for that. So we are going to have today, Whitney Douglas is going to be back with us, our Thailand coordinator, and talking, following up from Monday's conversation here in Formation. And before I ask or invite her to come, I'm just going to start open with a word of prayer. So if you'd pray with me. Lord God, our God, we give you thanks for today, for the beauty of creation and all the things that you have created for us and given to us. Thank you for all the butterflies that have been around on campus and just the beauty and the amazement of those creatures. Thank you, God, for today, for this time, for this space that we can gather together, where we can learn together, where we can grow together as a community. Give you thanks for Whitney this morning, for the tough job and the tough message that she has for us and the difficult topic. And just pray, Lord, that our ears and our minds would be open to hear from Whitney, from you, what you want us to learn this day and this time. In your name we pray. Amen. So Whitney, if you want to come forward, wherever, oh, there you are. I saw you last back there, and I'm like, I don't see her.
Thank you. Good morning. So some of you may or may not have been here on Monday, but Monday we looked at Matthew 18, and we were talking about accountability when we have done harm and when we recognize that there is something within us, brokenness, painful things within us that are causing harm to come out. And we looked at some shocking and harsh words of Jesus that invited us to consider that even the most painful of sacrifices is worth it to get rid of the brokenness within the way we view people, the brokenness within the way we treat people that leads to the path, the person we become, our character, and that brokenness. And so today we're going to look at what healing and how forgiveness is a part of that looks like for someone who has experienced harm. And so we have to remember that God has these really intense and high standards for us as people of faith in the world. And in that, we have to deal with our own stuff and in order to create a path forward. But then we also have to recognize that we don't have control over what the person who did us harm is going to do. Whether or not they're going to follow the way of Jesus or not, whether even if they claim to follow the way of Jesus, that's not in our control. And so I want to start by citing a few sources. Monday, I forgot to cite that Dr. Tim Mackey is who I owe a lot of my theological thoughts around Matthew 18:2 from Monday. And then today, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about stuff that I learned from Reverend Desmond Tutu in the book of Forgiving, as well as a couple of other sources. This book called Leaving Silence is written by Susanna Griffith under her old name, Susanna Larry. She's got a book coming out in March called Forgiveness After Trauma that is a little bit of a kind of follow-up to that. And Leaving Silence is a book for someone who has been the victim of sexualized violence or anyone who has walked alongside someone and wants to walk alongside someone well who's been the victim of sexualized violence, and that's a really important book. And I had the opportunity to have a meeting with Susanna and get a little bit of her thoughts, and that has informed, she shared from her upcoming book, that has also informed a little bit of today. And that where we need to start is what forgiveness isn't. And most importantly, forgiveness is not a burden to you or the burden you have to carry if you're the one who's experienced harm. It is an invitation, not a burden, and not a command. That's really important to recognize. And it's not the same thing as reconciliation. Reconciliation is the term that we use for relationships coming back together after harm has happened. Forgiveness does not equal reconciliation. Reconciliation might be something that comes after forgiveness, but not necessarily. They're not the same thing. And so sometimes, especially I think in church spaces, we can think about those things as the same thing. When we hear somebody say something about forgiveness, we think what they're meaning is coming back into relationship with the person who caused the harm. Forgiveness isn't easy. Forgiveness is really difficult work, and it takes an active willingness to engage. It's not just saying, I'm sorry, and then, or receiving an I'm sorry, and then following up with a I forgive you. That may or may not be true forgiveness. It's not simple. It's not easy. It's not weakness. It takes an immense amount of strength to go through the emotional work that it takes to get to forgiveness. And if you have gotten to the ability to truly forgive when significant harm has happened to you, then you are anything but weak. It is not subverting justice. True forgiveness creates a path for justice to exist in its truest form. When we are able to separate ourselves from bitterness that creates a desire for retaliation and vengeance, then we can create space for justice, true justice to be enacted, in which there is accountability and consequence for the harm done, and freedom for the person who's experienced harm. Justice is incredibly important for forgiveness to exist. And forgiveness is not forgetting. The exact opposite is necessary for forgiveness to happen. You have to have almost this brave and fearless remembering of the hurt in order to be able to really forgive the hurt. If you've forgotten the hurt, that's called dissociation. That's not called forgiveness. And it's really not quick. It's a long road, and a road that isn't predictable. Each person's journey is going to take whatever time it takes for you, and it's not something that can happen quickly. Furthermore, I want to note a couple of things that are absolutely essential for forgiveness. One is safety. If you are actively experiencing harm and you are not emotionally or physically safe, then forgiveness is not what you're invited to right now. Safety and getting out is what you're invited to. And until those things have happened, forgiveness isn't where you need to go. If you're actively in a harmful relationship, you need a path out of that to safety before we explore forgiveness. And forgiveness requires truth. If we are going to not, if we downplay what happened or even lie about what happened, then we haven't really forgiven. When we say something like, oh, it's okay, I forgive you, that's not truth, and that's not forgiveness, and it's not helpful. You all have a little yellow piece of paper, right? If you would pick that up, hold it up for a second. So this piece of paper is to explore an analogy together. It is representative of a relationship, and when we have relationships, you go through difficult things and you go through little harms that you've experienced, and that might do a little bit of damage to that piece of paper. But when there's really significant harm, when there has been interpersonal violence or sexual trauma or some massive betrayal, then you do more significant damage. And I want you to take your papers and rip them in half. When we have done that kind of damage to a relationship, that paper is never going to be the same whole piece of paper again. There are paths forward that might look like taping that piece of paper together and getting stuff sorted out. And there might be, like now it's just two pieces of paper and you're moving on. And the more things happen in a relationship, the more times you tear that up. And you might tear and tape back and forgive it, and then tear again, and tape back and forgive it, and tear again. And soon you've got something that is nothing like what you started with, and maybe not usable for its original purpose at all. I don't know if any of you have ever made paper from scratch. You can take recycled, used paper products and tear them up into tiny pieces. We could all tear these into just confetti. Please don't do that for the sake of the custodians here at the church. But we could make it into like confetti, and then we put it inside of a blender and add a little bit of water, and it makes it into a pulp. And then you can lay that pulp flat. There are tools to make it more perfect, but you could do this just out on like a plastic cutting mat in your kitchen, set it in the sun, let it dry, and it might have come back together in a way that you've got this adhesive piece of paper that you could use as a piece of paper. And in that, you have a very different product than you started with. And you'll have different uses for it and a different path forward. But that is maybe the most restored kind of component. When we take apart everything that was and mutually agree what ingredients go back into this and make something new, that can happen after harm. But there are lots of potential ways forward. But to claim that forgiveness is something simple and easy is like claiming that you can just tape those two pieces back together and it's as good as new. It might still function for a lot of things, but it simply won't be the same. So this here is a graphic borrowed from Desmond Tutu's book here, the Book of Forgiving. And he talks about here that we've got where the hurt, harm, loss square is kind of where we start when something has happened, and that leads to pain. And out of our pain, we're going to have choices. And when we choose to perpetuate pain, hurt people, and we choose to do harm, then we create that revenge cycle. And the revenge cycle is something that is really difficult to get out of. And so you find yourself choosing harm, which is a rejection of our shared humanity, which invites this revenge or payback or retaliation, which might lead to more violence and cruelty, leading to more hurt, harm, and loss. And the cycle repeats itself. And the fourfold path of forgiveness that Desmond Tutu introduces us to is this invitation to a path out of that cycle of just perpetuating harm. And so when we make that choice to heal and go down this path, remember, it is not quick and it is not easy. And it is a choice. And so when you choose this path, you might be choosing a path that starts today and takes your whole life. It might take months or years or decades, and all of that is very okay. This is not some, four-step plan to fix your life, self-help book kind of thing that is just going to offer you a quick fix. There just is no such thing in this kind of context. So the first step that is really important is telling your story. And this is the part where we have to be willing to engage the truth. And I think it's important to note that telling your story is or rather hearing your story is a privilege to be earned, not a right that people have. And so you need to be thinking carefully about who has earned the right to hear your story, who has shown that they are trustworthy, that they are someone who desires to listen and support you without trying to jump to fixing things, who's a trusted and safe person for you, friend, family, could be a therapist, mentor, spiritual leader. And you're going to want to speak the truth and start with the facts. What happened? And find somebody that can hold that truth. And every time we tell our story, it loses a little bit of the power it holds over us. And so as we're able to release that, we're able to figure out what healing continues to look like. But we have to be able to tell the story, and we have to have somebody safe to tell it to. As you go through that process, you might consider the value of telling the story to the person who did you harm. And what's really important here is that that has to be something that is safe. And so sometimes there's certain types of harm that have happened, certain situations in which that's unwise and unsafe. You may also consider the alternative of writing a letter, whether or not that ever gets to the person, but of the ability to express to that person what happens can also be a beneficial component of this telling of your story. And as we continue this work of finding out what happened, for some, it can be really hard to remember details. Your brain might not have pieced it all together in a logical or chronological order, and that's all very okay. Your story is yours, and however that's coming out is okay, and it's natural and normal for that to not be in a logical or chronological order, and it's still your story. But as we tell it, we learn to accept that we can't change it, that it can't be undone. The harm that happened, the pain it caused is there. There's healing possible, but you can't undo what happened. And the more we're able to lean into telling the story, again, might have to retell it over and over, the more it loses its power and creates space for freedom. And after we have told the story, we need to specifically name what hurts. Sometimes we can detach ourselves from the feelings and just share the facts of something that happened and not acknowledge the pain. And sometimes we might feel, especially if we have somebody else telling us what forgiveness looks like this pressure to minimize the hurt and not focus on that part of it. But it is an incredibly important thing, because harm that was felt and is denied always finds a way to express itself eventually. So we can stuff emotions down pretty effectively at times. You can push them aside and not deal with them. But when we do that, we create something within us that is ready to burst at some point. Something will trigger that past hurt in the future, or it'll slowly bubble up, and then it'll hurt more and more. And so we have to name it. We have to be able to process it, or it doesn't find a way out of us. That is the way to heal. You identify the feelings, and you remember that no feelings, whatever they might be, are inherently wrong or shameful or something to be feel guilty about. You might be angry, you might be scared, confused, lonely. You might have moments of joy in the midst of those pain as little things are happening in life and feel like, I don't know if I should experience that, and be confused there. There's all kinds of different emotions that can arise, and none of them are inherently wrong. Naming them and feeling them is an important part of this journey. And the reality is that it also involves grief, right? That these kinds of things that happen are a loss, even if the loss is just of what we thought to be true, of our innocence, of our trust in humanity or trust in a person or a system or a family. That is a loss worth grieving. And there are, I'm sure many of you have heard the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And all of those are important parts of working through a loss. And so acknowledge where you're at in that grieving process and be okay with that. Give yourself permission to hang out in that space and work through that grief at your own pace. And as you have done that, when you are ready to move forward, when you have found people that are sitting with you, hearing those feelings without trying to fix them, and they're helping you process and releasing those things, then you might be ready to move on to the stage where you start to think about granting forgiveness. And granting forgiveness is a choice, and it is always the choice of the person who has been harmed. It is inappropriate for someone who has done harm to say, "You need to forgive me." Even if they've said sorry or attempted to make amends in some sort of way, a true apology never requires anything in return. A true apology does not require that you give back an "I forgive you." If you're really sorry, you don't need me to forgive you to be sorry. And so what forgiveness is, though, is this invitation. I believe this invitation from God to say, this is awful. This should have never happened. It is not okay. And it was never yours to carry. I want to take it. And it's this releasing of that pain and that burden, that bitterness that is only hurting you and might create in something that hurts you and others in the future. But it is this invitation to release it, to let it go. That's it. It is not a command, and God never tells people who are actively in harm to stay and forgive. There is always this path towards justice that God lays out when we're witnessing active harm, even throughout some stories that do end in forgiveness in the Bible. And so when we get there, we're able to offer forgiveness when we can offer truly a new story about what happened, when we can release something, when we can recognize humanity in the person having done harm and release that, then we're able to offer forgiveness. That may or may not mean telling the person who harmed you that you forgave them. That might be entirely this personal thing of release. It might not even be possible at times. And then the fourth step is renewing or releasing the relationship. And that, again, is the choice of the person who's experienced harm, whether they want to renew the relationship or release the relationship. The ability to release the relationship and release the harm and pain and bitterness that you hold and say, I'm never want to see this person again. There needs to be a separation. We need to go our separate ways. And renewing the relationship, a renewed relationship is never going to look like it did before. We already talked about that with the paper, right? It looks like something new. It might be stronger because of what you went through, but it always looks like something new. And it's okay to not be ready for this step. It's okay for this step to take years and years of work to get to. Renewing a relationship is not restoring. You can't go back. And it's really important to not go back to the same type of relationship dynamics, or you wind up in that same place of hurt again, and you haven't really effectively gone through this cycle. You've maybe been manipulated and brought back into this cycle of harm. one of my favorites, Taylor Swift, has these lyrics in one of her songs that is just, I think, really wise, and I want to offer them to you, that sometimes giving up is the strong thing, sometimes to run is the brave thing, sometimes walking out is the one thing that'll find you the right thing. And when you know in your soul when it's time to go, go. I want to invite you to start engaging with me in this green flag activity. Take a moment right now at your seats to think about what type of green flags there might be in a relationship. So on Monday we did red flags, signs that relationships are unhealthy and it's time to go. What's a green flag? What is something that shows you this is a trustworthy person? Whether it is a friend, a colleague, a classmate, romantic partner, any of those type of categories of relationships, there are signs of unhealth and there are signs of health. When we're talking about situations where harm has been done, even in the most small settings, a green flag is taking responsibility, is owning what's yours to own. In a relationship instead of getting defensive. There's an example. So now I want to invite you to go to the stations on the side where you see the green flags and write on a flag and bring those up to the front vases. And those flags will join the red flags on our campus, inviting people to think about both harmful things in relationships that need to be addressed or need to cause you to choose different relationships, as well as green flags that invite people to think about health, not just the lack of a red flag, but a green flag is a true positive flag. So it might be the opposite of what you wrote on Monday. But you guys can already be like standing up and moving to those spots and grabbing the flags, writing on those and bringing them up.